It was the summer of 2018, when Adam Miller, a seasoned hiker in his mid-30s, decided to spend a weekend hiking through the dense wilderness of Blackwood National Forest, Oregon. Adam was no stranger to the outdoors. He had been hiking for years, drawn to the solitude and beauty of nature. Yet, despite all his experience, this trip would leave him questioning the very essence of the forest, as he would encounter something that defied explanation. Blackwood National Forest, with its towering trees and labyrinthine trails, was known for its isolation. It was the kind of place where one could lose themselves in the serenity of nature, away from the distractions of the modern world. That was exactly what Adam wanted, a break from the pressures of his everyday life. His plan was simple: hike the trails, camp under the stars, and reconnect with the world in its purest, most untouched form. On the first day, Adam arrived at the forest, parked his car at the trailhead, and began hiking with nothing but his backpack and a map. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. He spent the day hiking, taking in the natural beauty, stopping only for short breaks to hydrate and eat a quick snack. The further he hiked, the more remote the landscape became, until he found himself deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road. By late afternoon, Adam found a small, secluded clearing near a stream, and decided to set up camp for the night. He set up his tent, built a fire, and made a simple meal. As the sky darkened and the fire crackled, he sat back in his camping chair, enjoying the silence of the forest. It was a rare moment of peace, one that he had long been craving. But as the sun sank below the horizon, the atmosphere around him changed. The forest seemed to grow stiller, as if it were holding its breath. Even the wind had died down, and all that remained was the deep, unnerving silence. As he prepared to crawl into his tent for the night, he noticed the forest had become unnervingly quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling, heavy silence that filled the air. It was around midnight when Adam was suddenly awoken by a faint sound. At first, it was so soft that he thought he was imagining it. But then it grew louder and more distinct, the unmistakable sound of a crying baby. He sat up in his tent, his heart pounding in his chest. The cry was faint but clear, echoing through the trees. The sound was so out of place, it didn't make sense. Adam knew there were no children in the wilderness. He listened closely, trying to make sense of it. The cry was coming from somewhere nearby, deep in the woods, but it sounded so far away, almost like it was being carried on the wind. Adam's rational mind told him it was impossible. A baby could not be out here, miles away from civilization, in the dead of night. Yet the sound persisted. It wasn't a normal cry either. It was drawn out, full of desperation, as though the baby was in pain or distress. He tried to ignore it, hoping that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the crying continued, louder now, almost as if it was growing closer. His curiosity and concern got the better of him. Adam grabbed his flashlight, slipped on his boots, and stepped out of the tent. The forest was eerily silent again, except for the distant cries that still floated through the air. It was almost as if the sound was guiding him, beckoning him deeper into the woods. Adam walked cautiously in the direction of the crying, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. As he moved deeper into the forest, the cries grew louder, more distinct. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but his need to understand what was happening pushed him forward. After about 15 minutes of walking, Adam came to a small clearing. He shined his flashlight into the darkness, but there was no baby. No one. The only thing that greeted him was the thick darkness of the trees surrounding the clearing. He scanned the area, his flashlight slicing through the night, but saw nothing. No signs of a child or a person. The crying had stopped, leaving behind a silence that was even more unsettling. It was then that Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He had this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't explain why. The air felt heavy, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. For a moment, Adam considered turning back. But just as he turned around, his flashlight flickered and died. He cursed under his breath as he fumbled with the batteries, trying to get the light to work again. But just as quickly as it had died, the flashlight blinked back to life. That's when he heard it. The crying. Right behind him. His heart skipped a beat as he slowly turned around, his eyes searching the darkness. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But the sound was unmistakable. The baby's cries were loud, almost as if it were right next to him. Panic surged through Adam's veins as he took a step back. He spun around and started running, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest, once a peaceful retreat, now felt like a trap closing in around him. The crying was still there, following him, echoing through the trees. With each step, the sound seemed to grow louder, until it felt as though it was right in his ears, right behind him. He ran faster, his breathing heavy and labored, but the sound never stopped. It was as if the baby was following him, no matter how fast he ran. Adam ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until he reached his tent. He dove inside, zipping it shut and desperately trying to calm his racing heart. The crying had stopped, but the sense of dread that hung in the air remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching him. As the night wore on, Adam lay in his tent, wide awake, staring into the darkness. Every creak of the forest made his heart race. Every gust of wind sent chills down his spine. The silence, once so comforting, had turned into something far more sinister. He could still hear the faint sound of the baby's cries in his mind, lingering in the corners of his consciousness. The next morning, Adam woke up exhausted and disoriented. The events of the previous night felt like a nightmare, but he knew they were all too real. He packed up his camp as quickly as he could and hiked back to the trailhead, never once looking back at the woods behind him. When he finally returned to his car, Adam took a deep breath and started the engine. He couldn't explain what had happened in the forest that night, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never return to Blackwood National Forest again. Adam Miller never spoke much about what happened that night in Blackwood. He avoided hiking for months, his peaceful connection with nature forever tainted by the memory of that eerie crying baby. Over time, he convinced himself it was all in his head. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal making strange noises. But deep down, he knew what he heard that night wasn't normal. Others claimed to have experienced the same thing in Blackwood National Forest. Some say it's a ghostly legend, stories passed down from hikers who swore they'd heard the same sounds. Others believe it's the haunting of a lost child. But Adam knows better. He knows what he heard, and he knows it's something that will stay with him forever. And to this day, when he hears the faint cry of a baby in the distance, he can't help but wonder, could it be real, or is it just the memory of that night haunting him all over again?